Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to our second panel on just transition and gender and food security. We had one yesterday, which was very successful as well. And today we have two speakers, Ms. Flynn Newman from the UNFCCC Secretariat and Ms. Teresa Anderson, who's joining us from ActionAid. So I'll just ask them briefly to introduce themselves for 2 minutes, and then we can go to the presentations. Fleur, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Vositha, and thank you for inviting me to join this discussion today. Yes, my name is Flynn Newman. I lead the work on gender and climate change under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, under the convention and the work under the Paris Agreement. I'm also the gender focal point and focal point for women for the Climate Change Secretariat. My background is originally as a lawyer, and I also have a science degree in sustainable development. And I'm really pleased to be able to join you today.
Thank you, Fleur. It's great to have you as always. Teresa, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hi, my name is Teresa Anderson. I'm Climate Policy Coordinator for ActionAid International. ActionAid's a federation working for social justice in 45 countries. And although I coordinate the climate work, I also specialize in issues of land, agriculture, agroecology, and adaptation. I do a lot of work at UN climate negotiations to protect rights, lands, livelihoods of vulnerable farming communities. I also coordinate Climate Action Network's working group on agriculture. And I also work a lot with our ActionAid country offices across the Federation to do climate policy work and implement programs on resilience, on disaster risk reduction, on agriculture and agroecology. And I also have authored a lot of reports on various issues relating to these, including the principles for a just transition in agriculture, which I'll be outlining in a few minutes.
All right, thank you very much. So let's start with the presentations. Teresa, would you like to go first?
All right, we'll start with this. I'll talk about the principles for a just transition in agriculture and food systems today. Why do we need a just transition approach to agriculture and food systems? Well, it's because agriculture really is a significant source of the world's greenhouse gases. If you put together all the way across the food system and take account of the energy needed to produce fertilizers and pesticides, the amount of deforestation, what happens when you apply stuff to the land and do the farming, if you count the impact of livestock and soil loss and mechanization in agriculture, harvesting, transport, processing, refrigeration, if you combine the total impact across the life cycle of the food sector, we're talking about estimates vary between 20, 30, sometimes even some estimates say 40% of global emissions are captured by the food system. So there really is an urgent need to talk about this very clearly and address what's going on here if we're going to avoid runaway climate change. But at the same time, we have to recognize that agriculture is the sector that is probably the most vulnerable to climate impacts. I mean, every time we see a climate disaster, it's always the farmers who are on the front line who are losing their crops from either droughts or floods or cyclones, or even if it's not a disaster that makes the news, you know, rainfall patterns when they change really affect farmers' planting and harvesting times and can completely lose or at least reduce the harvest for a season. We see as rain is getting, rainfall patterns are getting shorter, more erratic, less water, shorter growing seasons. We see food production is really being affected, and farmers are incredibly vulnerable to this and not getting the support that they need in order to deal with these challenges ahead. But there is a risk, even as we talk about the sectoral transformation that we need within the agriculture sector, that is going to affect potentially millions or billions of people's lives and livelihoods, because it's not only about the food that we eat, it's about the billions of people who already rely on the food sector for their livelihoods. And there is already deep inequality and injustice in the food system. The State of Food and Agriculture report, which came out again earlier this year, comes out every year. Over 2 billion people are hungry or suffering from food insecurity. And that's 2 billion people out of our current world population. It's mind-boggling. And the fact that many of those people that are deeply hungry are themselves food producers gives us an idea that there is something, a deeply systemic problem here. And at the same time, so when we start talking about climate solutions, what do we want to do to fix the problem? Many farmers, they feel demonized, they feel defensive, they feel blamed for the climate crisis, and in fear for their survival, for their families, for their communities, they will sometimes feel very resistant and block climate action. So, sorry, I just got a message there that just interfered with things. So we've been, as ActionAid, we've been looking at the question of just transition. How can we make a transition from polluting systems to systems that work for the planet and for people and farmers in a way that is just? And there's been a lot of good work and talk over the last decades or more from the energy sector, talking about what a just transition can look like. So we've been in conversation with unions, with people in the energy sector and people across the food sector to understand what a just transition in agriculture could really look like. And we see a lot of useful lessons from that sector, but also some major differences in the agriculture sector, including that actors in the agriculture sector are less formally organized than they are in energy systems. For example, coal miners in the north, global north, are traditionally quite well organized in unions. Also, big power differences between different stakeholders and farmers. And that sort of makes it much more complicated to talk about farming and farmers and food producers as a collective block and how they engage in the power relations. So farmers' unions play a different role from industrial unions. And there are, of course, big differences in global north and south. And of course, we need to take into account the urgent need for adaptation just as much, if not more, than the need for mitigation. So what we've really learned from the brilliant lessons of the just transition in energy process is that a just transition is not only about what we transition to, but it is really absolutely how we do it. And if there is one thing that everybody takes away from this message today, it is that not only the outcome, but the process itself must be just. You need a process to make sure that the people who are already marginalized, whose voices are not heard, and who are already facing deep inequalities in the current system, are able to participate and join in and shape the change so that it works for them, and that the just transition process that we come up with addresses their concerns, the injustices faced by rural communities, and that this process can really accelerate the appetite even among farmers and workers and the public for ambitious climate action that also fixes other problems too. So when we spoke to all these different people to understand what a just transition in agriculture could look like, and we put out this report in December last year, which is shockingly coming up to a year ago now, but it still feels very fresh. We could see that most of the things that people were saying sort of fall into 4 large clumps of categories. The first one was coming across very clearly was that any transition must address and not exacerbate inequalities in the food system. The second key point is that we have to transform the food system to work for people, nature, and the climate. It has to work for all 3. And then processes have to ensure inclusiveness and participation in these planning processes. You can't just announce a policy without really involving the people that it's going to affect. And then the fourth point is you really need to develop a comprehensive plan and policy framework. So it's not just about one law and that you go away. It's a much more systemic, multiple threaded piece that needs to make this happen, and I'll unpack why that is in a minute. So just to dive straight in, the first point about addressing and not exacerbating inequality in the food system is there is such deep inequality already there. We have and so that means that we have the risk that top-down simplistic climate policies could really leave rural communities stranded, with few options for their secure livelihood. What we're already seeing across the world really is that big industrial agriculture is already squeezing small farmers out of the system. We're seeing, the concentration of land and wealth in the farming system because of big industrial agriculture. Small farmers are being squeezed more and more, and workers are also being, labor farming workers are being extremely squeezed and exploited by this big industrial agriculture system as well. So we need to address that at the start. Then we have to recognize that even though women make up, 43% of the agricultural economy in the global south, so, almost half of farmers are women in the global south, and in many countries, particularly in Africa, most of the farmers are actually women. They still face systemic barriers, whether they're cultural barriers or policy barriers. So cultural barriers might be that it's, not very encouraged to that women farmers are expected to do the farming, produce the food for the family, and also do all the other care in the family. But you might have other systemic problems, like women farmers might not, because they've grown up in communities where they haven't had the same level of education, so they don't get access to the same information for support and extension services. You also get deep systemic policy inequalities where often in countries, extension services only talk to male farmers. Women farmers aren't allowed to get land. Women farmers aren't allowed to get credit, and all other, it's much more difficult for them to enter into local markets and sell on equal terms. Lots and lots of systemic problems that really ignore the fact that nearly half the world's food producers are women, and yet these policies are making it very difficult for them to operate. And we could actually address a lot of food insecurity issues if we were actually to make policies much more gender responsive. So then you get other issues such as hunger. I already mentioned that there is so much, the big industrial agriculture system is failing to feed the world at the moment, even though we have all the land that we possibly could put over to food, to growing crops. There is still the appearance that not enough food is available, but that's false. It's just that the crops that are being grown are going to the wrong purposes and not to feeding people. And then of course we've got this issue of climate injustice, of the fact that the countries that have done the least to cause the climate problem are the ones that are suffering the harshest impacts already, and the countries that have done the most to cause the climate problem are the ones who are suffering the impacts least, which means that the problem continues and continues because we don't have a feedback system where the people that are causing the problem really understand what they have, that they have to fix it. So then when we talk about what to do in the agriculture sector to address climate change, we need to make sure that we don't just have tokenistic solutions, we don't just have rushed approaches, that we don't let corporations greenwash business as usual, and that we're not pushing false solutions and land grabs. We have a big push for at the moment for climate solutions to include scaling up of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I can't go into that in great detail here, but it's a huge risk that hundreds of millions of hectares of land potentially could be grabbed from smallholder farmers to put over to tree plantations to try to suck carbon out the air, in order to combine this with a new emerging technology which they hope will someday work, called carbon capture and storage. I'm sorry if we can talk about this later in the questions if you have more questions about that, because I understand if that's a little bit confusing. But what it means is that some of these climate solutions are going to threaten the very people who've done the least to cause the problem and who we need in order to feed the world. So the second principle for a just transition in agriculture is that we really need to transform the food system to work for people, nature, and the planet. What that means is we can't just leave it up to the market to solve the problem. We can't just leave it up to individuals to do the right thing. We can't to buy the right thing, or to trust that farmers will, if we encourage them to do the right thing, they'll make that difficult choice on their own. No, we need a far more systemic change coming both from the bottom and the top to help farmers and consumers make the right choice, the easy choice, rather than the right choice, the difficult choice, which all too often it is in the food system at the moment. So what we need is incentives to shift from industrial agriculture to agroecology. The reason why industrial agriculture is so harmful is, well, there are multiple reasons why, in fact, but we can shift, we have to shift from industrial agriculture to agroecology, because industrial agriculture, which uses loads of fertilizers, loads of pesticides, for a start, the production of these fertilizers uses a lot of energy, massive amounts of fossil fuels in order to produce these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And that is not usually talked about as part of the agriculture emission system, but it's a massive component. So there's that. And when you apply it to the soil, it actually not only does that tends to kill off the microbes, the soil bacteria, the living things in the soil that amount to much of the carbon that is stored there. So it actually leads to a degradation of the soil and soil turning back into atmospheric carbon dioxide. So for that reason alone, industrial agriculture is a disaster, compared to agroecology, which uses natural approaches such as, you know, composts and mulching and manure and things to take natural material and put it on the soil to strengthen the health of the soil and also to store carbon. And avoid the emissions used and produced in the development and application of fertilizers. So then the other reason why agroecology is far better is because it encourages crop diversity rather than single types of crop that get grown across a huge area and that actually are more vulnerable to pests and disease as a result, because one pest or climate change could just wipe out an entire crop. Whereas when you've got a diversity of different crops and varieties, it means if the weather changes, so, you know, half of those crops will actually be okay. Monocultures tend to do the opposite and put all your eggs in one basket and increase the risk. So those are just some of the reasons why agroecology is really the future, and it's now recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in their special report on land, which came out in August last year, that agroecology is really the direction that food systems need to go. And we're starting to see the right movements and signals coming through governments now, including the EU and others, that we recognizing the science is very, very clear. We cannot continue with industrial agriculture at this scale. We need to start making the shift to agroecology. We need to debunk all these myths that agroecology is just a niche option. It's actually the real solution for a long-term planet viability. So the other thing that we need to do to transform the food system is to really understand and address how industrial meat production, factory farming, has also been a complete catastrophe for the climate. Because right now, more land is used to feed livestock than is used to feed humans. And those livestock are being crammed into utterly appalling factory farming conditions. And there's and a lot of food is being wasted. So at the same time, like this is particularly a problem in the global north and a few other global south countries that have high levels of industrial meat or meat production and feed production. But this is, but basically the industrial meat system is driving massive deforestation. And of course, we know those ecosystems are absolutely necessary to help keep the planet under 1.5 degrees. So largely meat production, especially in the global north where it's heavily industrialized, is driving deforestation. This story is coming out much more clearly now. People understand that. And that's why there's a shift to not only less meat, but also better meat that doesn't require deforestation, but that lets animals, behave more naturally within the land. So part of that story is about protecting and restoring the ecosystems that we so urgently need to protect the climate, and also not using so much land has already been put towards biofuels. I think about 30 million hectares of land has been put towards growing biofuels. It's completely unnecessary because that is actually worse. If you add in across the life cycle, biofuels are usually worse for the climate than coal. So they're a false climate solution anyway, but they have been a disaster, driving land grabs, deforestation, rising food prices and hunger. And so this really needs to stop because we need to be using our land for farmers and food production. Other bits that we could do to fix the food system would be to really avoid waste. The gender responsive policies and services that I alluded to earlier would be a really helpful part, and also making sure that adaptation is a key part of any transformations in the food system. We can't be talking about land only in climate terms. We really need to understand that every action we do needs to make sure that the food production is also resilient to climate impacts now and for the future. And within that, we also need to apply food sovereignty principles, as in, really respecting and the producers of food, restoring their control over the food system, and strengthening local markets rather than putting everyone at the mercy of the big industrial corporations who have far more control and dictate far too much of the food system at the moment to everybody else's detriment. So the third point is about making sure that planning processes to enable a just transition are really inclusive and participatory. And that it's really important as a start to map stakeholders for a start. So there's an interesting case study that we include in our report about in Bangladesh, where a certain UN agency was encouraging farmers to shift from rice production because it is recognized to be quite polluting. It does produce methane if grown on a scale, to mango production. The agency told farmers, right, you're going to make more money because mango is a high value crop compared to rice. So farmers were persuaded to make that shift. But what hadn't happened, there hadn't been a mapping of the various other stakeholders in that food system, including the fact that seasonal laborers rely on the rice production, planting and harvesting, that the women in the community were very much relying on selling food and other products to those laborers. And there was a whole invisible group of people who were not mapped by this change. The other factor was that rice, you get 2 or 3 harvests a year, whereas mango, you only get 1. So this whole transformation sounded good on paper, but actually when you looked at the real story, it meant that tens of thousands of people in an instant lost their livelihoods, and it was a real disaster. So you need to map the stakeholders carefully and then include them in a just process so that their views are heard. And we're not just talking about the powerful people who have suits and PowerPoint presentations who can come and give a convincing story to government. No, we need to make sure that the women, in the community are able to talk about this amongst themselves, understand the implications, understand what it is, the challenges they're facing and what they need, and engage with governments in their terms and their way. And they may not have the PowerPoint presentations, but work by civil society groups like some of us to empower the women and help them articulate and advocate for the changes that they need is absolutely critical in this policy building process. And sometimes you'll need to build knowledge of climate change in order to make that step more effective, because still in many of the communities that we work with, and I'm sure many of you work with as well, folks do not yet really know the full extent of why these changes in the weather are happening. And so often that building climate knowledge is a useful first step to allow for better engagement. And then once you have that, the role of organizing, and yes, unions can be really very helpful to help build the collective power of people so that they can articulate better, and so that representatives who we know are actually rooted in these perspectives can take these messages to where they need to be heard. So the fourth point is about developing comprehensive plans and policy frameworks. And it's about really making sure that you do an impact assessment, and that the planning happens. Often it needs to not only happen at national level, but also the region which is going to be affected. You need to have a proper conversation at that level, understanding the impact. And the policies that you put forward need to be very inclusive, including gender responsive, but also understanding that other, various folks are extremely marginalized, and that you need to have policies that address these issues. So then, as part of the solution, you need to ensure that when you're going to move from one type of farming economy to either another type of agriculture, or even out of the agriculture sector altogether, if that's what is decided is a strategic move, then you can't just leave the farmers on their own to make that move. There has to be training and reskilling, and you need to ensure social protection. So like usually in the form of cash money support, so that people can, as they make these shifts, they'll be losing their livelihoods for months, if not years. They need the support to make that transition in a way without losing everything or being forced to sell their land and migrate to the city. And of course, as a key part of this, we need to regulate corporate power, and we need to make sure that we're linking with all the other relevant sectors and issues, including, issues of hunger and poverty, water access, and all the other important SDGs that relate to this. So this is why just transition in agriculture really needs to be integrated into climate policies, including national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions that all governments are developing at the moment. And also linked, it could be really a key strategic part of climate finance proposals, is to ensure that the transitions that countries want to make in their agriculture sectors are really inclusive, and demonstrating this when applying for climate finance. I was going to touch on COVID as well, but I realize I've gone somewhat over my time. But maybe I'll just summarize to say that COVID has really highlighted the need for social protection to help farmers survive this very, very difficult experience where they've lost livelihood, and if they don't get the support, they'll be selling their land or moving to the city, and they won't have the money to plant for the coming season. So we'll have an ongoing long-term food crisis in the context of COVID if governments don't recognize their obligations and step up very quickly. So, but the good news is that the solutions to COVID and to pandemic-proof our food systems are the same things we need to do to make our food systems fit for purpose in an era of climate change. So this is really an unprecedented opportunity to climate and pandemic-proof our food systems, and we can use a just transition in agriculture process to get there. And so I'll just flag a couple of briefings that you might be interested in that ActionAid produced. One is about this COVID threat that's coming on food security. I really do urge you to read that, actually, because it is important to understand what's on our way, the actions we need to take, and also the principles for a just transition in agriculture that I've just outlined. Now, I'm so sorry to Vositha and Fleur for taking so long, but thank you for the space.
Thank you, Teresa. A lot of information. I think we'll hopefully manage our time. We have 90 minutes, so we'll be okay, I guess. So Fleur, over to you now. Please do take your time as well. I did text you as well. We do have time to discuss after your session, as in after your presentation. Great,
thank you. So thank you, and it was a really very useful introduction for my my talk, which is at a slightly different level, but obviously has an impact on the local level and on the national level that Teresa's just been speaking about. And there are many things that resonated with me in what Teresa was saying. So I'm just going to give you a very brief background into how gender has come into the climate, gender considerations have come into the international climate intergovernmental process. And then speak a little bit about just transition in that context, and a little bit of what the sort of international policy framework is that can support, in fact, the things that Teresa was just speaking about. So within the UNFCCC, the first time that there was any kind of reference to anything that might look like gender considerations was in 2001 with a decision on increasing, there was a recognition that women were disproportionately represented in the climate change negotiations. So where decisions were being made in relation to how the world addressed climate change, there was an understanding that the number of women who were participating was significantly less than the number of men. Took 11 more years before there was another decision on this, and in that time the understanding of the relevance of gender considerations in climate policy grew, and so the next decision actually had a goal on gender balance under the UNFCCC process, and that was in recognition of the fact that there had been little progress since 2001 in that context. Gender and climate change became a standing agenda item on the COP agenda, so on the Conference of the Parties agenda, and that matters because if it's on the agenda, it gets attention and it gets spoken about and gets negotiated. And then there was also a request to the Secretariat to start monitoring and reporting on the gender composition of national delegations to the Climate Convention, to the constituted bodies, which are technical and policy bodies, and to the Bureau, which is the sort of governing body of both of the COP and of the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't take quite as long. So 2 years later, there was a 2-year work program on gender, which was agreed in 2016. And then in 2015, the Paris Agreement included human rights language, which specifically referenced gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. And gender responsive climate policy was specifically addressed in the article on capacity building and on adaptation. The following year, a 3-year work program was agreed on gender, and for the first time, the subsidiary body for implementation was asked to develop a gender action plan. And that was done in 2017 and ran till 2019. So last year, an enhanced gender work program and action plan was agreed, and this time for 5 years. So that is what we are currently working under. That's not the whole story. There are many decisions on gender throughout the different topics, so on adaptation, mitigation, climate finance, technology, and in fact, the Katowice climate package, which was the sort of rules for the Paris Agreement, also included gender considerations in many areas, including in relation to response measures, which is where just transition is dealt with under our process. So what we have is a Lima work program on gender, which is sort of a framework agreement, a framework for, and then a gender action plan as an annex, and within the gender action plan, there are priority areas, and under each of those, there are a set of activities. So the Gender Action Plan, as it stands, has priority areas, and these priority areas were identified as being critical. It was looking at all of the decisions that had been made. So there's over 60 decisions related to gender since 2001 that fall within one of these categories. So on capacity building, knowledge management and communication, gender balance, participation, and in this context, it's meaningful participation, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and women's leadership, because this remains a persistent issue. Coherence, and this is coherence across the UNFCCC process, so ensuring that gender considerations are taken into account in all of the thematic areas of the UNFCCC in a consistent way, and then but also across UN system, the UN system where gender and climate change are also being dealt with. And then priority area D is on gender responsive implementation and means of implementation. And here that's capacity building, climate finance and technology development and transfer. And then priority area E, which is on monitoring and reporting. And Teresa did explain a little bit about why we're talking about gender in this context, but I think it's probably worth going over that in a little bit of detail. So the point here is that every anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission comes from a decision, choice, action, or inaction of a human. But not all humans have contributed or experienced the impacts of climate change equally. Climate change exacerbates, and there were examples already provided, existing and creates new inequalities. Gender, as well as other multidimensional factors, including age, ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic status, among others. And differentiation with regards to gender occurs in at least 3 areas. So around impacts and vulnerability. More often than not, women and girls are worse off than men and boys from the short and long-term impacts of climate change, such as flooding, drought, heat waves, saltwater incursion, anything you can think of there that we're in terms of the natural world, but also in the context of what climate change is doing to economies more broadly. However, there are instances of men and boys suffering differently and in some cases worse than women due to the nature of male-dominated work. So, for example, the heat issue around those who are working in outdoor construction jobs is a significant issue and will become an even more significant issue as the world warms. Or customs and norms regarding heads of household, so who gets the forced migration and who migrates. In many cultures, men and boys are also affected by societal customs and norms around masculinity that link masculinity to destructive practices and see caring for the environment as unmasculine or feminine, and that in that context being undesirable. For example, not eating meat, using recycled shopping bags, driving a small car or not driving at all, or not having a car at all, or taking public transport. So that's impacts and vulnerability. And decision making is another area in which there's differentiation on things like long-term solutions to where the investment is going in relation to energy or transport, or in this case, food systems. And immediate responses. So the decision making around what happens in the aftermath of natural disasters or in the preparation for. And then the third area is benefits of the solutions and responses. So who's able to claim insurance, for instance, after natural disasters? If you don't own assets, you're not going to be able to insure them, and you are then going to be in a position where, and this is often the case for women. And immediate or access to finance or technical support. And this, I think Teresa also mentioned in terms of agriculture. And the differentiation here comes from the fact that women and girls, it's about discriminatory patriarchal laws, customs and institutions that result in women's exclusion from participating in decision-making and community processes, limited awareness of legal rights, including human rights, limited or no access to control over resources and assets, things like unequal burden of domestic and care responsibilities, limited access to necessary sexual and reproductive health and healthcare, particularly in natural disaster situations, and increased exposure to gender-based harassment and violence and impoverishment, including when a male spouse migrates or otherwise leaves the household in cultures in which having a female head of household is not seen as where they are disadvantaged in terms of what access they have to resources. Under the Lima Work Program, there is in fact a specific reference to just transition. So in this context, in the preamble, it's actually taking the words from the Paris Agreement in relation to just transition, and then in the decision itself, making the link to the fact that gender-responsive implementation and means of implementation of climate policy and action can enable parties to raise ambition, because if you're doing things more effectively, then you automatically start to look at ways in which you can achieve more, as well as enhance gender equality. And this is linked to a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. So as much as climate change is a challenge and is creating the potential for exacerbating existing inequalities, it also presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to accelerate the achievement of gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. Addressing climate change requires a radical shift from business as usual. And as countries seek to transition to low carbon, climate resilient economies and societies, they have to identify new ways, different ways of doing things across their economies. And that includes in relation to food systems, and really need to do so in a just and fair way. Speaking to the processes under the international policy framework processes, one of those is the nationally determined contributions that all countries have. And this is adapted from some work that UNDP is doing on piloting with countries on the development of gender responsive nationally determined contributions. And these are 4 entry points that have been identified, and in Teresa was speaking about planning, and that is included in the sort of national analysis and consultations, and that those consultations need to be done not only at the national level, but also at the regional and local level. And then the other place is in institutional frameworks and coordination mechanisms, and making sure that, so in this case, that may include things like ensuring that the Department of Gender and or Women's Affairs is also included in the climate change coordination mechanism at a national level. Alignment of national policies and planning instruments. So there are a lot of policy instruments related to gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. And there's a need to ensure that what is happening there is also informed and has a climate lens, as much as having a gender lens in terms of climate policy and action. And then the need to ensure that things are actually being monitored and evaluated, so you can pick up things like the example that Teresa gave of a solution that was not a solution in terms of food security. And, you know, climate change absolutely threatens the agricultural value chain, and having a gender responsive value chain approach is useful in analysing climate risk as well. So this is, it's part of the process. It's not separate from the process. 89% of countries have identified agriculture as a major priority within their sector, within their NDCs. But they're still, having identified it doesn't mean that it's supported necessarily from a financial or technical perspective. and remains a vulnerable and risk area. This is taken from the NAP Global Network, where they have been also looking into gender responsive national adaptation plans, and in some ways is very similar to the sort of entry points that have been identified in relation to the nationally determined contributions around planning, where you need to be looking at it in terms of planning, but then it also needs to be included, and elements need to be included in implementation and monitoring and evaluation. And then these enabling factors around capacity building, and it's capacity building, as Teresa mentioned, on people understanding climate change for a start, but then also understanding the gender considerations in that context. Things like information sharing and making sure that information is in a form that everyone can access. So that point about education levels, but also who has access to technology, who has access to, and so there are different ways of doing things. Some countries have very successfully used radio programs, for instance, as a way of communicating this information instead of relying on written information, and through a technology that is in fact accessible to a wider range of people. And then the institutional arrangements are, critically important. And the need for gender responsiveness in the agriculture sector, I think, has been very clearly identified and set out by Teresa earlier. The fact that that a large proportion of the agricultural labour force in developing countries is made up of women, but that they then own less than, in some cases, less than 20% of the ranging from 20% or less in Latin America. And female farmers have less access to, sort of worldwide, have less access to the inputs that are needed, the extension services that are needed. They're routinely paid less for their labour. So there are really good reasons for wanting to address these from a rights perspective, but also from an effectiveness perspective. If women are not able to access the same resources, then they're also not as able to contribute to the solutions that we need to make in terms of climate change. And it's I think I'll end on the point that climate change is a systems issue. And as Teresa's example gave, if you try to address a systems issue with a single solution, or a solution that doesn't take into account the system, then you are going to end up with very suboptimal outcomes. And we live in a world that's made up of many systems, and what we need is systems change. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Fleur, for the overview of work that you do on gender and how it interconnects with just transition in the agriculture sector. So I have a question, but before I ask the question, I would invite who are joining us from Facebook Live as well as on the Zoom portal to type in your questions. I think there's a request on that Seni also put there. So please type in your questions to the chat box, into the chat box, and I will read it out to our speakers. And before that happens, I have a question to both of you. So we spoke about different kinds of right-based issues and legal processes that hinder women being actively involved in the agriculture sector, and also violations of just transition aspects that we want to have in the climate process. I found it interesting that in many countries we have men holding the rights to land, and women who are engaged in agriculture activities are not recorded into data systems because of this, because they do not get recognized as farmers due to this reason. And I also found it interesting that in an example somewhere in Southeast Asia, I think it's in Vietnam, this happens the other way around, where men do not have land rights. It was like a very rare case that I heard of, but I think it's in Vietnam, I'm not entirely sure, but in a Southeast Asian country. So I find it interesting that this could be both ways. And it's a cultural application, right, that we're thinking of here that has led to a legal issue. So do you have any suggestions how we can address these cultural aspects in a manner that doesn't seem invasive and coming off from a distance and telling what to do, but in a more constructive way within the system, so these things can be changed? Do you have any examples of actions that you are doing at the moment, or ways that you think could work well without making it look like you're going to tell people what to do, but that they think that this is what needs to happen? It's actually to both of you, so please feel free to share your opinion.
I'm happy to go first, Fleur. Great. Well, yeah, as I can tell our story as ActionAid and how we do deal exactly with this issue of land ownership. We've and agriculture, climate policy, resilience, etc. Of course, being an international organization, but federalized in 45 countries, we are both seen as an international organization and a national organization, because many of our members actually started as national organizations and then joined our federation, but you know, there's still always the risk that you can be seen as an international organization coming with external values. What we do at community level to help shift the conversation and shift realities is to create participatory processes at community level. So women often, you know, the injustice against women is so systemic. You know, it starts right from the very beginning. You know, you might have less chance of going to school. You're told you have certain responsibilities and don't have certain opportunities. And it goes all the way from there in terms of what land and credit and access to market and everything else you get given along the way. But what we and so at community level, we see this plays out in a very insidious way when climate impacts hit, for example. So you might get communities where the men are the community leaders and they're asked maybe by local government, so how are you affected by climate change? And they'll talk about certain things, you know, my cash crop was lost, my house was lost. And, you know, they'll name those things. And the women's stories of how, oh, well, I have to travel an extra 4 kilometers a day to fetch water. Or, you know, now I'm having problems feeding my food and feeding my children. Now we have more gender-based violence in the community because people are hungry, and etc. These stories often don't get heard. And the realities of what it's like to be a woman and a woman farmer often don't make it into even the community planning, let alone the higher up levels of policy planning. So what we do as ActionAid is we work with communities to create safe spaces, first of all, for women to talk and chat amongst themselves. And in that space, as a woman, you feel more able to talk about your realities without being judged by the men. Then in that process, you can start talking about, so how has climate changed our reality? How has this lack of land rights affected us? You know, you can have these conversations as women. And then once you've got your story really clear and straight, even amongst yourselves, then it's much easier to take that story to a community meeting and go, hey guys, you know, listen to us. We've actually got something really important to say here. Present a clear story and you know, make sure that that is embedded and the women have the right to speak and participate in that community discussion. And we found so many small and big strategies emerging from that range from, you know, women realizing, you know, in a community in Senegal, I think I was, where, you know, the women realized that actually if they could just have money for a little mill, it would save in their community, it would save, you know, loads of time walking back and forth to a village 10 kilometers away. It would free up loads of other time and energy for other things like growing food. And there are millions of other little things that have helped the community organize themselves better through these chatting and empowerment processes. And time after time, I speak to the men in the village, you know, the chief, who'll say every single time, I was super skeptical about this. You know, women, we didn't really think that women had that much to say because they're just about carrying water. What would they know? But now I understand how important their views are and how the whole community benefits when women have what they need and the access to land and the support that they need. And the men themselves in the community get converted along the way. It's been an incredibly powerful process. So women's empowerment benefits everyone, including the children and the men. And I think that's the argument to take.
Thank you, Teresa. In Sri Lanka, when we are working with the communities, we've noticed that though women do not sometimes talk in groups, in a farmer group meeting when they come in, the husband and wife, they accept that they make decisions together. And in terms of decision making about long-term aspects where they're going to invest money, like infrastructure or like machinery that they might need to buy, that women do play a role in influencing the decision. So sometimes this role is not visible, but it actually exists. So it's about, I feel, getting it out there and saying that this is happening. Some accept it as an open thing that they do, while others don't. There's some research that we're doing, and some of them are, I can see as attendees there. So maybe if you want to share your experiences or points, do type it in the chat box so we can bring it to the discussion as well. Fleur, over to you now.
Thank you. And yes, I couldn't agree more. That this is when we're talking about entry points and we're talking about participation, it's exactly that we're talking about. That climate planning processes need to include this level of engagement with community, which is not easy. It's not, nobody's saying this is easy, but what the benefit that comes from that is immense. And we are getting to see more data on those benefits. And it also speaks to the point about the sort of sounds very high end, the kind of policy alignment and coherence. But this is really the point about there are laws that can support the in many countries, there are laws that can support enhancing the rights of women to resources, for instance. Or if there aren't, there are institutions that are there that are working to achieve that under a different space. So, gender equality and women's and girls empowerment issues are also being dealt with under the SDGs, under the Beijing. So ensuring that those processes are also being informed by the process on climate planning and the needs of women in the context of climate change, and making sure that there is this cross sectoral and cross ministry and cross department discussions about this, because it's what we've found is that often those who are working on gender equality issues are not necessarily aware of how climate change relates to the work that they do, and it does. And it's this sort of applying these two lenses of climate and gender to pretty much everything we do, because climate change affects pretty much every aspect of our societies and our economies. So, yeah.
Thank you, Fleur. So taking a step back from gender, both of you, I'm sure you work, I know for a fact that on Action for Climate Empowerment, which has a component of youth engagement education as well. And Teresa, I'm sure you worked on the ground with different stakeholders, which include youth. Before we go to the other questions, I'd raise this question now. What options or entry points do you see to engage youth in the processes so that just transition is inclusive of youth action, and in the agriculture specifically? Maybe Fleur, you could take it up on what you're doing in education related aspects or plans for ACE in the next years, and there is maybe a few experiences that you have as policy as well as on the ground. Fleur, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure, I can start. So in relation to, yes, this is, and I guess it's one of the things about working on gender is that, as I say, it's multidimensional, and so it's both the work that I do in terms of leading the work on education, training, public awareness, participation, and access to information, as well as the work on gender, because there we see that there is a need also for us to identify different people within populations that, you know, and there's a number of different ways in which a just transition, you know, the climate change in education is not consistent across countries. And so, you know, one of the things that would be ideal to see is the inclusion of a strategy on ACE in the context of nationally determined contributions, for instance. So for countries to be recognizing that this is a tool for ensuring that their population is in fact fully informed on climate change, but also that young people are understanding before they have to make choices about, but you know, when they have choices, but the choices they make in terms of where they want to focus their study, for instance. All of that needs to happen at a much earlier age than it's happening at the moment. So we know that in many countries, climate change is kind of limited to the tertiary education sector. So what we would want to see is really this being engaged at these discussions and all aspects of climate change, which includes just transition, because it's an integral element of where we need, you know, the transition we need to make from where we are now and where we need to be, would be included in education curricula, and we anticipate that we will see more of this, and what we will be doing is helping to bring together those sort of good practices that are happening already, so that countries can also see the way to do things, because sometimes having to do all of these different things in different areas is overwhelming. But we have seen also a number of countries who are looking to do things. So Ghana has recently launched an ACE Youth Hub, which looks at specifically sort of vocational training aspects and ways in which they can engage youth in getting involved in understanding what climate change is and what it means for the future of work.
Thank you, Fleur. It's great that you brought up Ghana, because that's one of the countries we focus on in some of our work as well, on national adaptation plans and also migration. Maybe we can bring it up later. Yeah, Teresa, up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad you asked this question, because young people really are absolutely critical to the future of food. It is actually very disturbing. We look at the patterns around climate change and worry about our food futures, but also if you look at the rate at which young people are leaving the agriculture sector or not planning to get into agriculture, there's a storm coming in terms of food production in that sense as well. We hear from a lot of communities that that young people would like to stay working in agriculture, but they just see how difficult it is for their parents and families, you know, with climate change, with the lack of support they get, with all the other challenges, with the pressure from corporate agriculture, the land grabbing, etc. It sometimes can look like a no-brainer to just think that my only chance is to leave the rural areas and head to the city. So there is definitely both a push and a pull factor going from rural to urban migration, but it's also connected to an employment challenge in urban areas as young people look for employment in the cities, and often there isn't that employment available. So the next generation are really, facing some real challenges, both in terms of livelihood and food security. This needs to be absolutely an explicit part of the conversation about agriculture. And certainly we're in our current strategy working much more to integrate this work into it, because I think while there's been a lot of conversation about the importance of gender in agriculture and across the climate system, there's been so far, I would say, largely tokenistic recognition of youth. We talk about the youth, intergenerational issues, youth will be affected. And of course, now with the Fridays for Future, the movement, the mobilization that is coming from youth who realize the risks of climate impacts on their future, that is starting to shift. But I think there's a lot more work needs to be done to create the systems that will keep youth in farming and profiting from it, and finding fulfilling livelihoods and communities through continuing to feed the world. So we need explicit strategies to reach out to youth. It is also part of the gender work, so we can't leave out the fact that when we work with women, a lot of these are young women facing particular problems that are different from often their older sisters and mothers, etc. So these are conversations that can be disaggregated. But again, participation is absolutely essential. So hearing spaces in which we understand and give space for young women and young people to talk about their fears, their concerns, their opportunities, and what they want to see happening and what they need to make it work for them should absolutely be the basis upon which we build policy to support them. And then when we understand that agroecology is very much part of the solution, because industrial agriculture is so problematic, we can see there needs to be training to help farmers have that knowledge. I mean, there's this myth that industrial agriculture is all scientific and agroecology is very basic and anyone can do it, but actually so much knowledge is required and being lost between the generations as farming systems have moved away from agroecology to industrial agriculture. So all sorts of knowledge about recognizing pests and diseases, about, rather than just spraying pesticide everywhere, what are the other natural strategies that have worked for thousands of years of agriculture and would still work now if we gave them a chance. The seed diversity, how to save seed, and all other sort of land management strategies that farmers have always known and passed down to generation have just been dropped and almost lost in a generation of industrial agriculture. So we desperately need to reverse these and reverse this knowledge loss and have a systemic system of training in agroecology for young people. And it's not only for the climate and resilience that agroecology is good, because when you're not spending loads of money on buying hybrid seeds or fertilizers or pesticides, you're actually keeping a lot more of the cash in your pocket. So it really makes a lot of sense for farmers to and young people to make this shift. Other things that we need to see being more part of a youth responsive agriculture system, in addition to training, is an understanding of how to use social protection tools like cash transfers, cash support, etc., to help farmers stay in farming when troubled times hit them, troubled times that they have done nothing to cause, like whether it be COVID or climate or whatever. And also reviving support in local markets, because there's been such a shift to producing cash crops for export. There's really a race to the bottom, prices dropping, and really local markets offer an opportunity for people to improve their crop diversity, because crops don't have to travel as far. Foreign markets, more people along the food chain can engage at a local level. You get the local economic multiplier effect. Whereas if I spend 5 shillings, let's say, at the local butcher, and he spends that 5 shillings at the local baker, and she spends that 5 shillings at the local grocery, vegetable seller, then that 5 shillings has become effectively 20 shillings being passed around the local market and lifts the whole local economy, rather than if I shop directly in a supermarket and that money just goes to the headquarters. So really, the solutions to youth really are embedded in many of the other solutions to lift up local economies and give young people the opportunity to see a viable future. And just I'll mention something fun we did also in Ghana, since we're talking about Ghana, is last year we've got a climate program working with young people in Ghana, and one of the strategies that they used to reach out to young people and get them engaged in climate issue was one of our youth groups made a music video about climate justice that's actually helped to reach out and bring young people into that conversation. And it was really participatory. They wrote it themselves, they had loads of fun, and it was a great song and tune, actually. It's super catchy. So these kinds of things, young people can be super creative when they haven't been stuck in front of a screen like the rest of us for the last 20 odd years. So let's help them find the solutions.
It's very interesting that we're talking about different countries, but some of the things are very similar. And also, like, I have a colleague, and we have a few colleagues in office whose background is in agriculture. They're young people below 30 years, and some of the parents are farmers. But when they talk about their families, one of the colleagues shared that the brothers do not want to get into farming because there's income only once a season, like, once the crops are there and it's not regular. And that climate risk in different angles is impacting choices that is not direct. And interestingly, a lot of people in the urban areas, while they're moving away from agriculture, we see young people in, rural areas. In urban areas, there's an interest to go back to agriculture and create commercial activities and entrepreneurship. So if we can merge these together and have, in the local ways that you mentioned, in the localized decision-making processes and commercial processes, that might help a lot of people develop their income as well as address climate risk. So very interesting discussion. I'm going to the questions now that's in the chat boxes before people get annoyed with me. So this one is for Teresa. As you see in a country, what kind of policies that can, rewording it, what would be the policies that could be introduced or practically implemented for effective transition in the agriculture sector? And you could probably bring in just transition angle to it.
Thanks for the question. So I would personally find it hard to name one single thing, so I'm probably going to name a few things that hopefully the combination of things can work. But certainly as governments, develop and roll out their nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans, it is really important that these are inclusive and participatory. They need to open the door to hear from communities about what their realities and aspirations are, and realities and needs and aspirations are. And so having inclusive NDCs and inclusive NAPs is absolutely critical. And as we start to shift, as they hopefully start to shift towards the systems that we want to see based on agroecology, and depending on the country that you're in, certainly in the global north, there should be behavior changes about consuming less meat, and policies that change that. We can look into the role of subsidies, for example. Most countries really actually heavily subsidize industrial agriculture, including fertilizers, including industrial meat production. And that sometimes is either through the chemicals or through the infrastructure that they provide to enable these systems. You can shift those subsidies towards helping agroecology take root, because there's very little support currently goes to the things that we really need to see, like agroecology. And you could do a country like Zambia, I think, spends something ludicrous. I heard, and I don't know if this is true, but I heard 70% of the national agriculture policy is spent on subsidizing fertilizers. Now, that is a lot of money that could be better spent on extension services and training and support to farmers, right? To do adaptation, etc. That is very badly spent money. And there's plenty of money available even at national level potentially to make that shift. So this should be part of national policy as well. And it could be far more effective to also regulate corporations, rather than giving them tax breaks and letting them control our food systems, we should be really shaping our food systems and limiting the harm and control that corporations have, because we've seen over many years they've had a lot of chances to show their benefit, and really we're starting to see the impacts that they have. So yeah, and then creating, like I said, integrated and comprehensive planning and policy frameworks that weave in all of these elements together would be the most effective way, I'd say.
Thank you, Teresa. Fleur, you mentioned about some of these aspects in your presentation as well. Would you like to add to this, or should I ask you the next question? Next question, yes. Okay, so it's an open question. I'll direct it to Fleur. Maybe Teresa could add afterwards as well. The question is, okay, this is something that came up in the last session as well. I'll read it out. When it comes to just transition, how can we address the needs of informal or unregistered workers across the food system, especially in developing countries? How can we reach and integrate this sector into the just transition? I guess you can bring in the gender component to this as well. I'll start with Fleur, and then Teresa, you could add to it.
Thank you. And yes, I think when we talk about the informal or unregistered systems, whether it's food or any other, women are often overrepresented. But this also goes to Teresa's previous points around social protection. One of the things that COVID has highlighted is that the inadequacy of social protection systems across the globe. So this is not just in developing countries. The social protection systems in many developed countries have also not been, have shown, you know, that the diversion of funds away from social protection system over many years has been highlighted by COVID. And so in terms of informal and unregistered workers, this also goes back to how you do your planning and who participates. So ensuring that it's not only creating those safe spaces where those who are vulnerable because of perhaps their, not all informal or unregistered workers have issues around immigration, but to the extent that people feel unsafe in engaging in public processes because of their living situation or their status in terms of being a citizen in a country, it's about ensuring that the planning processes are also inclusive in that context. And to the extent that you're able to change people's status from informal to formal, and creating systems that allow for that. And it's being done. It's not as if this is not being done. And I don't know if Teresa can speak to that any more specifically, but I am aware of systems, not necessarily in the food sector, but in other sectors where this is being done. And it's also about our economic model, the very large elephant in the room, is that the economic model that we have does not have at its core things that are required at its core. So things that are often in the informal or unregistered sector are not valued in our economy or in our economic model, and that needs to change.
Yeah, thank you.
Teresa.
Yeah, thank you, Fleur. You know, I would absolutely agree with all of that. And also maybe to add that since the question I think was about the issue of whether the formal sector and the informal sector, of course, in large part it's about learning from how in the global north, particularly in the just transition experience in the energy sector in the global north, one of the reasons why we have this language in our vocabulary and in the UNFCCC and in the Paris Agreement is because of the amazing work of the unions. And they've, the power of people when they work together is absolutely amazing. So what we've seen is really clear examples in parts of the world where workers who all understand that they have something in common, and they band together and negotiate together and leverage their collective power to really force those in power to understand, that we the people have the power. And unfortunately, the food sector, as was alluded to in the question, is a very different proposition from the energy sector in the global north and the unionized coal miners, because you've got small farmers, medium-sized farmers, large-scale farmers, plantations. You've got laborers. You've got many of whom are migrant workers, and so many of the farmers and laborers and including the migrant workers aren't registered either with a union or even registered within officially registered as employees. And this puts them in a very vulnerable position where they're at much greater risk from exploitation. So in Europe, where I live, a lot of the fresh salad and tomatoes and stuff are grown, and much of the food, in fact, is actually harvested by migrant workers who are much less poorly paid than, let's say, native workers in the European countries. And this is the way our food system is based at the moment, on the assumption that we can only eat based on somebody's exploitation. And it's very hard to find alternatives, certainly in the global north, to fresh food that isn't based on exploitation. Even in the organic sector, it's not perfect by any means. And so the one thing that the unions themselves are working towards, certainly in the other energy sector, is they see just transition as a motivation for workers to unionize. Like, if you want your sector to become fairer for you, and you don't want to be trodden over in the trample for climate solutions, then you should join a union. So that is part of the solution. But even in parts of the world where unions aren't necessarily, really there or working, there are some parts of Africa I know and in South Asia have large farm workers unions that can be quite powerful. And so probably in South Asia there's a lot of opportunity there to work with the farmers unions and workers unions there. But in other parts of the world where these aren't really around, still organizing is a really powerful tool. So like at community level, women form local women's groups or band together with the local area of villages and form a regional women's group that then go to speak at district level. And these can be groups that represent anything between 20 to 9,000, 10,000 women farmers, and they can be very powerful and articulate and make it very difficult for policymakers to ignore them when they work together. So people power really is the solution to all of this.
Okay, thank you both. We have 5 minutes more and a few questions. So I'll ask one question related to some of the stuff you mentioned. It's a long question, and I'll read it out, but I would hope you could answer in 2 minutes so that we could keep to time. So I'll take 1 minute to read this question. So the question is about accessibility to training. So when it comes to accessibility of training to accommodate just transition, especially for workers to acquire new skills on clean processes and technologies, educational leave might be necessary. What are the challenges that may be faced exclusively by women? What can be done to overcome these challenges? So that's the question, but could I make it a bit more general and ask you what are the avenues that are available to focus on training towards just transition, skill development towards just transition, and with a link to food security as well. Fleur, would you like to take it first, and then we go to Teresa?
Sure. I'm actually not aware of many that are specifically focused on the food sector there are actually a lot more in other sectors like the energy sector, where there's also been a much faster mobilization away from or recognizing what the future holds for workers within the sector, really. But training is one of the elements of ACE, and certainly this is something that we would see as being a key component of ACE strategies that countries can develop as and include in their NDCs. Again, this is about investment, what countries are investing in, and whether it's their own funds or whether it's the way in which they are engaging with donor countries, or whether the way in which they're engaging with financial mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund. These are things that can be included in projects or in funding proposals, but countries need to recognise that there is a need for this transition, and that goes back to the point about moving the system across. If you haven't yet acknowledged and made a decision on moving your agriculture across, then the training that's needed to transition everyone is sort of down the track a bit. But I do think it is something that is, just like capacity building is, training in this context is a key element of a successful transition and would need to be included in strategies and hopefully as a tool in nationally determined contributions.
Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are different levels and ways in which the shift will happen, and ways in which the training can take place. So, for example, for farmers who are currently growing, let's say, vegetables, a shift from carrot and vegetable growing to agroecology doesn't need to be that disruptive. Like, you can shift, you can actually train the extension workers to train them on farm. They don't necessarily need to take long times away. They can start even doing stuff side by side. In fact, a lot of farmers test a plot on agroecology first and then make the shift afterwards once they see it working, or once they see their neighbor's farm working. So a lot of farmers can, in the real world, integrate these two without much loss. But of course, you're going to have for some farmers, there might be an initial drop in income because it takes a while to build up the soil fertility, and if you're not using fertilizers, there might be 1 or 2 years where it takes a while for that soil fertility to build up. So you need support from the government to make that shift in that transition time, recognizing that this is going to benefit the country and the planet and everyone as a whole anyway. When you have regional planning processes in which a government might decide, or a region might decide, okay, look, our regional economy is heavily dependent on industrial meat production. Why don't we shift to a combination of tourism and graphic design and vegetable growing, or something like this? These are the kind of alternatives that could end up being the shift. And of course, for some countries, they'll be wanting to also shift external foreign earnings as well. So that will also be part of the plan. And then that does need a more integrated planning, in terms of, you need to add infrastructure for routes to markets, you need to do the training, you need to put in actual infrastructure as well for support and also help farmers who may have invested already in very expensive infrastructure for milking, etc., which takes years to pay off. So you need a very integrated system, of which training is integral, but not the only part of that. for sure. And if you need to take half a year off to do that training, then the government should be giving you the support to feed your family and keep your house and pay your rent while you're doing that training.
Right. Thank you very much, Teresa, Fleur. It's been a very insightful discussion, a lot of information, a lot of themes that initially we didn't think will come in when we planned the session, but there are a lot of other things that came up which relate to the discussion as well. So thank you very much for your time, always being available to discuss like today. And thank you everyone who joined us, asked questions and engaged actively. We look forward to talking to you again. So bye for now.
Bye, thank you very much.
Thank you, bye.